Right. So, I mean, what I'd like to know really is how you got involved in sports writing at first, because I've read State of Play, and you say that your inspiration for it is Hopkins, and you never thought you were going to be a footballer, so sports writer is the next thing.
Yeah, I was an appalling centre half, so there was no chance of that happening. I suppose it's funny enough, we're going to do a documentary on this book. I did one for my last book, No Hunger in Paradise, which is on kids trying to make it in football. And we're going to start the documentary at the time and the place where I fell in love with football. I think it's probably something that everyone around here could identify with. And that was as a little 11-year-old ball boy. And to prove I'm a fully accredited old git, it was in 1970. Oh, right up, okay. I don't know if you heard all that, but anyway. 1970, FA Cup quarter-final, Watford was my team, I was a ball boy. We changed next to the first team dressing room, can smell the liniment. And I had the perfect view of this goal by a guy called Barry Endine, who ended up as a welder in the northeast. They found him in a pub team. He scored the goal, which basically beat Liverpool's, Shankly's first great team, 1-0. And I saw what happens to a group of people, to a community, when something really special happens on a football pitch, which was, them going through the FA Cup semi-final as a little second division club at the time. And the place went nuts, but also I realised what it meant to the community, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a grown man cry. And it was a Liverpool fan. I can still remember him now. He had like one of these old donkey jackets on with the long scarves, which were in fashion at the time, which had all these pennants and badges on, weighed down. It must have weighed a ton. And he was sagging against a fence, crying his eyes out that Liverpool had lost. And I just thought, wow, I want more of this. And so a couple of years later, my dad, who worked on the local electricity board, came back. He scavenged 2 books from an empty house. One was a book of the glossary of the 1945 UK Parliament, which informed my sort of political beliefs, birth of the NHS, all that sort of stuff. And the other one, as Seth said, was The Football Man by Arthur Hopcroft, which was the perfect representation and time capsule of football in 1968. So my idea for this book was sort of an overarching look at football in 2018, and I hope it's the sort of time capsule that Hopcroft had. And what I try to do in all the books, I lived for a season with Millwall, which was an experience, and really educational. I understood now what it meant to be a professional footballer and the insecurities you have to deal with and the importance of the win bonus, and I'm sure it's something that Graham will talk about later, but the fact that it's a serious business and there are a lot of insecure people out there, and I try and basically address the issues around the modern game through the eyes and the experiences of the people who are dealing with those issues on a daily basis, be they concussion and CTE, where the book begins with the last 30 seconds in the life of Jeff Astle. I don't know how many of you know of him, but he was the man of 68 in the sense that he scored the winning goal in the FA Cup final. He died at 59. The coroner said that he died of an industrial injury, which was heading football. It took 14 years for his daughter to basically shame the FA and the PFA into doing something about that. Concussion's going to be a huge issue going forward. I've got mates in their early 40s who've been playing, who are looking at this and thinking, well, I've got to get tested here. And so to be in a room with someone who explains the horrible nature of their father's death in really vivid terms, that to me also, in the same sort of perverse way, is probably why I wanted to get involved in writing, because as a writer you can really almost insinuate yourself into someone's life. So, you're kind enough to mention Gareth Thomas, who did a book with Gareth, where, before he came out, he was considering suicide. when we were writing that book, when I was writing that book, I actually took him to the rock on which he was going to jump to his death, and talk to him about it. So that, as a writer, you really get deep and up deep and personal with it. So hopefully, all the books that I've done, be it the Millwall book or Going on the Road with the Scouts or the Managers, that Managers book begins with Martin Ling having electrodes attached to his head for ECT treatment after his suicidal episodes. We've been talking earlier on about the way that the academy system and the whole commoditisation of childhood comes in very early in football, and to see the human wreckage that football can leave behind is pretty profound as well. I try in the book to look at some, give some inspirational stories in terms of the thing about football is it touches people on a pretty basic level, and you can address social concerns through football. So, and these guys tend not to get any recognition, which is what I tried to redress in this book, where there's a guy called Tajayan Hutton who literally works in the shadow of Wembley Stadium, and he works in an environment where there's no budget now for youth provision in communities. He's got something called a corner league, where in essence it's a league made up of rival gangs, and the main rule, I don't think it's an FA rule, but anyway, the main rule is that they leave their weapons at home. Now that's sometimes breached because it all kicks off. They all turn up back with guns and knives and God knows what else. And Tajayan's this 25-year-old guy of immense dignity and fantastic foresight, doing some really good work in the community. So that's part of the attraction, is actually highlighting people like that. I did tell you I have long answers to one question, didn't I?
So your new book, State of Play, it's a pretty comprehensive overview of everything to do with football. I mean, it's grassroots, the elite, all sorts. What section is closest to your heart, would you say?
I think things which have a social impact, I mentioned a couple. There's a guy called Drew Broughton, who's in the second chapter, he sort of meets that classification of journeyman footballer, which I've always not wanted to use phrases like that because I think it's quite disrespectful, to be honest. But he's someone who had 22 clubs in his career, 66 managers, and he has some beauties in those 66, I can tell you. But after his career, he did a biomechanics degree, but also he's now working with about 10 to 12 young players at a high level, Premier League level, just telling them about the reality of the game. And as he says, I've lost count of the number of times I've sat across the table from someone who's crying, can't deal with it. And he said, I'm trying to prepare them for the brutality of the game and the lies and the insincerity and that voice in your head which will never go away, which says you're not good enough. And I suppose through him, what I try to do is give some idea of what a footballer goes through. Football is not just a game of X's and O's. It's a game of flesh and blood. And whether that's one of the lads that Drew works with is an England under 21 player. Can't give too much away because of clinical confidentiality, but he's at a top club. He's on that loan roundabout at the moment. Now, if you judged him on his social media profile, he's got everything. He's living the dream, baby. He's got his bling. He's got his followers. He's got the street smarts. Yet that same kid goes back into his bedroom each night, watches YouTube compilations of Ronaldinho, who's his great hero, and cries himself to sleep because he doesn't think he's ever going to be good enough. That's the reality of the game. And to try and articulate that, it was the sort of privilege of my position. The other thing in the book, what I tried to... coincidentally, I knew Dele Alli pretty well. I I was actually standing with Carl Robinson at the Milton Keynes training ground when I was doing the manager's book. And Delhi came over, and he was then just 16, scholar, and he said, look, Gaffer, do I have to go into the dome with the rest of the guys? They were having their obligatory coaching badges, and Carl said, no, you were here now. This is your job. So in a sense, I was there at the start of his career, which is a bit weird. But I saw him, and you get a feeling. I've been around sport for a long time. You get a feeling about someone very quickly that they've got something special. And I had that with Delhi. The real time there was an awful early season League Cup tie, and I was again researching the manager's book, and I was in the Northampton dressing room with Adi Boothroyd, and they were playing Milton Keynes on this particular night, and basically Adi was just kick the fucker up in the air. Basically, that was the game plan, and we saw this little 16-year-old kid laughing at the Northampton League Two defenders trying to volley him over the stand. He was laughing at them, and then you just think, well, okay, how will he deal with the transition which is coming? Because I saw him on the training pitch as well. He was doing some outrageous stuff, just completely off the top of his head. And I'm looking at Carl occasionally, and he's looking at me, and we're just going, what have we just seen there? There was one occasion where end of the session, they were just doing some sort of set-piece stuff, and the ball came across from a corner, and we all thought he'd mistimed his run, and he hadn't. What he'd done, he waited for the ball to fall behind him and just flicked it into the postage stamp at the top corner with the back heel, sort of an aerial back heel where he got his leg up to about here. And, you don't teach that stuff. It was just amazing. And I wondered how he would make the transition into what was obvious, that he was going to be, a top Premier League player. His background, the coaches that we've got here know that you need to understand the person to get the most out of the player. And with Delhi, I knew about his difficult family background, and he was in the situation when he goes to Spurs. He's in that situation that a lot of young pros, get into, where there are walls built around them, invisible walls. So they're in this strange situation that, in one way, they're completely overexposed. Everyone knows, they go out, the mobile phones are out, social media, can't do anything, can't breathe. As he says, he's 22 years old. He said, I've made some stupid bloody mistakes. He's done some daft stuff, but he's 21, 22. Now, he was in a situation of being exposed like that, but also he was isolated from everyone because all these walls have been built around him by PRs and agents and sponsors and clubs. So how does that kid then relate to real life? He's got money. Here's a kid who couldn't afford £1 for his early training sessions, who's now got a £4.5 million house. How does he deal with that transition? And you do it, I think, by going back to almost like human roots, and you get a sense of someone. So there was a mutual friend of ours called Simon Edwards, and Simon was a behavioural specialist, operated out of Harley Street, and he worked with Milton Keynes and a few other clubs, worked with Delhi because he was finding himself under pressure, couldn't sleep, and so Simon gave him one or two practical strategies to follow. They got on well. Now, unbeknown to all of us, Simon had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 3.5 years ago, and the prognosis was that he would survive for a year. He actually survived until this January, when he basically revealed the secret, phoned Carl Robinson and said, I've got about 10 days max. Could you and Delhi come to see me? And they also brought Benica Fobe with them as well. And there's a scene I sort of paint in the book where you've got this young, celebrated superstar who, the people who don't know him, is quite brittle, and he's larging it a bit, and he gets booed because of that. Relate that to the boy, the young boy who goes and sits literally on Simon's deathbed and talks about his hopes for his future and Real Madrid and everything that might come with him. But also they laugh about football and football's absurdities. So as an example, Simon once worked with an international centre forward, and when they met, they couldn't be eye contact. This player said, "Don't talk to me, don't talk to my face, talk to my football boot." And they said, "Well, okay, why? Don't mind you. I hope you don't mind me asking." He said, "Well, that football boot is my method of communication with the outside world. I score goals with that football boot. That gets me the contract, which enables me to look after my family, which means I've got a life after football." And they laughed about that. And I spoke to Dele after the funeral a couple of weeks later, and he said, "Look, playing's the easy bit. When I play for Tottenham or I play for England, I just go out there and I play the game that I played as a kid. The hard bit is dealing with all the shit that surrounds it. And that's what we don't give them enough credit for, I think. It's very easy to hit send on an abusive Twitter feed or, people in football, they've got families, cut them and they bleed. I know managers whose kids get bullied in the playground because their dad just happens to be a football manager. So I hope that people would read those sort of sections and think twice, 3 times about that sort of knee-jerk abuse that football is pretty much defined by these days.
Yeah, brilliant. One thing which I really want to ask you is, having read your Amazon author profile, you've got just amazing bio about the covering the surfing competition.
Yeah, that was in to answer your first question, which I should have done in full. I got into journalism. I've pretty much done everything that they've told me not to do. I was 16 at the local grammar school in Watford. Jacked in my A-levels to join the local paper at a time when local papers were still around. You can do that. I then left there after about 50. I got headhunted by a guy in Fleet Street called Reg Hayter, who was an agent, and he produced generations of really good sports writers. And you did that by going to matches, and I used to do 5 reports from the same game in a really concertina time span, maybe a radio report in there as well. And I learned on the job really, really quickly. Now, when I left the local paper, they said I'd never make it because I didn't have a piece of paper called the National Proficiency Certificate, which apparently means you're a really good journalist, but, hey. And I left Haters to go into it's a job which really doesn't exist now. I was chief sports writer of a big chain of regional papers called Westminster Press. Really grand title. There was only me. I was the only sports writer. So, but that meant that when I was 21, I was covering Olympic Games, and I did my first World Cup in 1982, which was an age of relative innocence. That was the time when news journalists turned up at football events for the first time, and that led to the legend of Dead Dog Beach. When we went to Bilbao for that World Cup, it was surreal because it's the only time, to my knowledge anyway, that the press corps got a lift to their hotel in the England team bus. And it will never happen again. But the news journos turned up there, and there was a guy called John Jackson who was the sort of conspirator in chief, and they found a dead dog by the side of the road, picked it up, and put it outside the England team hotel. So it was health scare for England football team. There's dead dogs all over the beach. Da-di-da-di-da. So that was where I came from, really, and it was an age really where you could do stuff. You could actually go and go out and challenge your boss in terms of, like, I was a Telegraph's chief sportswriter when I was about 28. Now, I sailed around the world on the yacht race, trained for 2 years for doing it. There is no way on earth, if I went today with that request, that they let, supposedly their chief sportswriter go to toddle off around the world. But actually, it grabbed people because it wasn't about sailing. It was about the people who were doing the sailing, and it had a big impact. So that's when I thought, right, I've got away with that. What else can I do? And so basically, I was looking for events around the world, which at the time were. I've always sort of backed myself as a writer. If I'm interested in something, I hope I know my way around the alphabet enough to actually say to people, look, this is something you should be interested in. So that event in Da Nang, which was overlooked on a beach overlooked by Monkey Mountain, which is, in the film Apocalypse Now, where it's the R&R place for the American troops. Hollowed out mountain with this huge gold Buddha in, and you climb up this little rickety ladder to the top, and you can see onto the beach. But they had the World Surfing Championships there, and the Buddhist monks were doing a roaring trade in weed at the time, and it was the clash of two complete cultures. And I just thought, yeah, it was a sports event, and I got it on the sports pages, but I think it's of a type. It's actually something which will interest people beyond sport, and I think that's where I've been really lucky in terms of, this is not a football story, but I was covering a rebel cricket tour of South Africa in 1990, and when we got there, this is in the days of apartheid. Essentially, the police set the dogs on the demonstrators, and it was called the old Jan Smuts Airport, and there was a marble staircase, and what had happened was that the demonstrators had run up the staircase and were cornered by the dogs, which they let on them, and when they'd all been carted off, there was an image that I used as my sort of intro, which actually led the front page the next day in the Telegraph, which is, pretty full on. And I just painted this picture of the trickle of blood going down the stairs. Don't have to understand politics or anything like that to understand that image and what it means. It's similar. I was at Heysel, where there was an image as we left the ground that night, passed in the area of the tragedy, where all I could see were discarded shoes. People had popped out their shoes. And that's where your imagination goes. I couldn't sleep that night because I was thinking, well, who was in that Adidas trainer, or who was in that Nike bit of kit? So I suppose, the great thing about the role that I had was that I had complete scope to do, almost everything. And I hope that people got something out of it. I don't know. I think we live in an age now where so much in football, especially, is manufactured. I don't know what you guys think of the Amazon, doco on Manchester City. To me, it's propaganda. It's to sell shirts in Mumbai or in Memphis or wherever. And so what I hope, and the great privilege of doing books, is that when I go into I've got 100,000 words, and that gives you the privilege of context. It allows you to offer a balance, but above all, authentic portrait of the game. I've been lucky. A lot of the guys in the game have read those books, and they recognise the world in which they work. It's not Walt Disney. Sport's not Walt Disney, and there are warts and all, and there are things that in that book I shine a light, or hope to anyway, on some pretty dark and deep places. But they understand, people in the game understand that. And as long as you're balanced, and we live in an age where balance isn't always the first thing on the priority list, that's why I love doing books, is that it gives me a chance as a hopelessly failed footballer, to try and give you some idea, give you the readers some idea of what the reality is.
I just have one final question before I open it up to the audience for questions. You've covered sport in 80 countries, right? Mm-hmm. You've come up with some absolutely amazing stories. Like you say, the under-21 international who cries himself to sleep at night. There's a manager who's got the electric shock therapy. Out of all those countries and all those stories, which is your favourite?
Blimey. It's like asking what my favourite kid is, really. I suppose being instructive. Finally, I'll tie it in with a topical story. Kevin Beattie, one of the great unheralded players of his time, loved by Sir Bobby Robson. This is going back a way. We had a trip to Poland in about 1980, when Ipswich were in the UEFA Cup. And my abiding memory of Kevin Beattie was -17 and the wind chill was ridiculous. I'd covered the Moscow Olympics the year before, and I had one of those, the whole sort of like the Eastern European hats, where basically you've got that little thing that the window you look out on, and I was freezing. He was short sleeve, and it was right. Okay, this is me, and that was an amazing trip because Poland was under martial law at the time. And I know this sounds like a history lesson, so forgive me, but there was a distant movement called Solidarity, and one of the most memorable interviews I did was in a place called Łódź, in the cathedral there. I did an interview with the leader of Solidarity, which was then a banned organisation in a military state, in a confessional. He was on one side of the confession, and I was on the other side. And that's pretty surreal. And I think also the South Africa experience, because that Rebel cricket tour collapsed and I ended up having to stay in the country for about 3 months and covered Nelson Mandela being released. And I went back the following year with the England rugby team and I got him to sign his autobiography. And he's just one of my great heroes. So sometimes when you meet your heroes, and I suppose people in football will tell you this, you can be disappointed, but I wasn't disappointed by that. It was just like, seeing a saint, basically.
Has anyone got any questions from...
You said you spent with Millwall, but you understand Millwall.
Yeah.
Like that. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, it was. I'll give you sort of the background to it. Like many good ideas, it began in a piss up. I was on the piss in Vegas at a 40th, and I shared a room with a guy called Alan Jackett, who was Kenny Jackett's brother. Now, Kenny and I had grown up in the same council estate in Watford, and I wanted to do a book, but my demands were outrageous, really. I phoned Ken when I got back from Vegas and said, right, what I want access everywhere in the football club. I want to be there from the first day of pre-season training. I want to be in the dressing room. I want to be on the bench. I want to be in your coach meetings. I want to be there when you release players. I want to be in the board meetings, da-da-da-da-da. And I thought he'd tell me to fuck off, to be perfectly honest. But actually, he thought about it for about 15 seconds, Ken, and said, actually, it's exactly what a club like Millwall needs, because it's judged on stereotypes, and so they allowed me in. And it's a very strange process, because you go in, when you go in on the first day of pre-season, and I'm sure Graham can identify with this. I'm the outsider, and they're all all the players are looking at me, thinking, "Who the fuck's he? What's he doing here?" And so the senior pro, who at that time was Neil Harris, who's now the manager, sort of came over and said, "Hello, mate. How are you? I'm Neil. Just call me Chopper. Everyone does. What are you doing?" And Ken had told them, and it took about 2 or 3 days, and then football's quite hierarchical. So basically, they knew that Ken wanted to do it, the manager. They knew the chief exec definitely wanted to do it, and the owner was really keen on it. So they thought, okay, fine. So we'll let Mike in, and it was a really weird thing that into about the third or fourth pre-season game, I'm in the dressing room, and there's that usual sort of the 10 to 3, 5 to 3 experience where you get the buzzer and everyone's out and it's all yah and high fives and slapping hands and all that. So I'm sort of keeping a step back, and there's a big goalkeeper there called David Ford, fantastic bloke, who says, "Right, in here you." So I get brought into the huddle, so I'm doing like the high fives, and I do a sort of clasp hand with Fordy, and he said, "What are you going to say to me?" And I thought, well, have a good one. So he does go out there, they win 1-0. So the first thing he does when he comes back in the dressing room, every fucking week, you've got to say that, the whole superstition bit. And it was funny because throughout that year, they were really natural with me. It was quite strange. I was just Mike the writer. And I suppose in football, if you've got respect for if they respect you for what you're doing, you can work quite well. And my vantage point was in the dressing room. It's going to sound a bit pervy, but I was just inside the shower. So I could look out to the dressing room. The dressing room's out there like this, and I could see everything, but they couldn't really see me. So they were acting completely naturally. So you've got that 10 to 3 where they're all, got the the popping pills and sticking stuff up their nose and everything. Not that stuff, by the way. And it was then the insight, and then talking to them over the season and being on the bus with them, and and talking to the subs during the games and all that sort of stuff, that you got this picture of a really. I began to work out how a football team works and that sort of human chemistry of it all, and they had 4 or maybe 5 or 6 what I called the governors. They were the senior pros, and they set the standards both personally and professionally for the group. So in other words, if any of the kids stepped out of line, they looked after it. It was not, I saw kids literally held up against the wall. And you saw friends fighting one another during training. Now, newspapers conditioned to make a great thing of that, and what a terrible thing it is that the right back wants to give a right hander to the left back or whatever. But actually, that's just a work in practicing. So I'm beginning to understand what football, how it operated through the people, through the way that win bonuses meant a lot at that level at the time. They were in League One, and the season I was with them, they were promoted at Wembley, which was a great end to the story. And you see the vulnerability, even at the start of that season. Their final pre-season game was a testimonial for lovely lad, an Irish striker called Richie Sadler. And in that game, a guy called Danny Sender went up for a ball, came down, blew out his Achilles. He was done pretty much. And there was a moment there where we got back in the dressing room, and I saw Neil Harris walk over to him, because basically Danny was in bits on the bench waiting for the ambulance and in real pain. And Neil went across to him and just kissed him on his forehead, really gently and really tenderly. So I saw that side of football as well. And yeah, and I suppose getting that trust and respect, you've got to give back to them. And the way I operated was I always work transparently with people. I don't hit and run or hide. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I want to say. And what I said to the Millwall boys when the book was coming out, or before it came out, when there was a manuscript, was, look, here's the manuscript. I gave it to the senior pros, the governors, and Ken and the chief exec and stuff. But I think Ken was quite taken aback because he didn't realise it was going to be in such depth and right in your face, but it was the reality of it. And he said, fine, this reality, I don't care. I said, look, if there's any factual inaccuracies, I'll change them. And I've been a stickler, and I still hopefully will be a stickler for getting things right, because I can't stand laziness in anything. But I had one of the players come to me, a lad called Andy Schofield, and we'd done a chat, and he talked about his younger brother, who was 23, and he died in bed. It was almost like a form of cot death. And he talked really emotionally about it and how it put perspective into his career, and basically he was playing for his brother. Made quite a moving passage within the book, and he came to me and said, "Mike, look, can you take it out?" And he said, "Look, it's perfectly written. You've got the mood. I said everything that you said I said in the book, but if my mum reads this, it'll kill her. And so there's just not an issue." Then I said, "Yeah, of course, that's out, gone. The book's not as important as that." It's little things like that get you respect within the dressing room. But, there is this sort of like cliche view of journos will just turn you over and go on to the next victim the next day. So, again, I wouldn't have experienced that degree of intimacy, and also, and sort of, had some fun. I love, I'm sure Graham knows this as well, the tunnel at Millwall is just like a zoo. It's fantastic because it's really narrow. It's probably about as narrow as this bit here. And there's always a game. I always used to go out 12th. So the first team go out, and Fordy, the goalkeeper, was at the back, giving it the big one. He's the 11th one out, and he's giving it plenty. And you'd see the away team come out of the dressing room, the smaller dressing room on the left-hand side. And it's obvious the manager's been saying, "Look, they'll try and get at you in the tunnel. Don't make eye contact. Don't make eye contact." So they come out and they file out, and they're looking straight ahead. And all I can hear in this darkness is this sort of like bunch of orcs outside going, "Wah!" All that stuff, the Millwall roar. So they're looking forward and thinking, "Fucking hell, what are we going to do here?" And, I saw teams lose games in the tunnel that year without a shadow of doubt. And there's always one player who just flicks his eyes over. And the moment he does that, he's absolute dead meat. And, that was real fun. So that was sort of a bit the showbiz of it, I suppose. But the real life, I suppose, I subtitled that book Family, Life, Death and Football, partly as a homage to Ken's dad, who died as they were in the promotion run-in, and we were playing at Huddersfield, and I was amazed when I got on the bus and he was on it. I said, "Well, how's your dad?" He passed away this morning. He actually got on the bus and did the game, and he said, "Well," I said, "Are you okay? As Sam, his wife and stuff." And he said, "It's what Dad would have wanted me to do this." And his dad was a former footballer himself. So it's little vignettes like that make it all worthwhile, I suppose.
So we've got one more question, and then we'll have a little break.
You said your story started out playing football. With everything that you know now about scouting and academy football and everything else, what advice would you give to yourself if you could go back and say when you were 12 years old, growing up playing football, going into the game? What would you advise yourself?
I'd make sure I had some talent first. I suppose if you're asking what I would say to a 12-year-old going into the game, I'd probably address the answer to the parents. When I did No Hunger in Paradise, the thing that got me about that whole meat market, the factory of football, is that you look at the parents who should be there protecting their sons and increasingly daughters, yet they're almost commoditising their kids, and they're thinking of them as pound notes rather than pieces of their DNA, if you like. And it's an interesting process. Trying to make it as a footballer is not a singular purpose. It's not an individual act. It's a collective ambition. So you go to academy games, and you've got entire families on the touchline. You've got the golden boy who's playing, then you've got his sister and his brother, and there might be a baby in the pushchair, mum and dad, maybe his granddad, and they're all there investing themselves in this kid. So you imagine what pressure's on that kid. He knows his family's future is in him, is invested in him. If he makes it, great. The stats tell you he won't make it. The stats are that out of the 1.5 million boys who are playing organised youth football in this country at any given time, only 180 of those will play a single minute in the Premier League. Now that's a success rate of 0.012%, which is about the same as getting hit by a meteorite when we all leave here tonight. So, you know, that's what I would say to that 12-year-old. Enjoy it, have fun. It's not your job. And you know, I spoke to Sean Dyche about it, and I've got a lot of time for Sean. You know, he comes out with that great line in here where it's, you know, affect the player, affect the performance. Sorry, affect the person, affect the performance. But also, you know, he said, look, I see players at 16 who are husks. They're gone. And they had talent, but they had so much pressure applied on them from the age of 9. There are kids now basically told that, look, they go into an academy at 9 and it's, yeah, this is your job now. Well, they're 9 years old. They should fall out of a bloody tree or play cowboys and Indians or whatever. You know, all the studies say that if you do multi-sport up until 14, 15, you've got a better chance of excelling in your what will eventually be your chosen sport. So football sucks these kids into a vacuum for its own purposes. Parents do too much. I see parents now recreating themselves as agents. I saw them smuggling agents into the back in the back of their cars into training grounds. So, you know, there are agents out there giving out cinema tickets to 10-year-olds. It's obscene. So protect the kid. Be a kid, I think, is the classic one with that. On a broader sense, if you're asking me about football, if you've got a modicum of talent, it's a fantastic way to make a living. And I'm not just saying as a player. You know, I've got great respect for coaches. You know, we were talking earlier on about, you know, the lack of almost due respect to the professional qualification of a football coach or an analyst. You know, analysts now are asked to pay, work for nothing for a couple of years. You know, my son's been through that system, and it's tough. But the game itself, there are some really good people in it. If I want to sum it up in one sentence, is I love the game and I absolutely loathe the industry.
Nice way to finish.
Yes.